Today's Stories from Storage is inspired by an etching entitled Meditation by the Ukrainian American artist Nicholas Bervinchak. This work was donated to the Ukrainian History and Education Center by Ms. Luba Kowalska, who actually found it at a yard sale outside of Philadelphia. To tell us more about this print and about Nicholas Bervinchak and his art and his historical context in general, we're really glad to be joined by Mike Buryk, a longtime friend of ours at the UHEC. Mike has been involved in our Nashi Predki, Our Ancestors genealogy program from the very beginning, and he was also the curator of our 2016 exhibition From Social Realism to Church Art. Thank you very much, Mike, for joining us today.
And thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Nicholas Bervinchak isn't exactly a household name, even among Ukrainian Americans. So, who was he and why should we care?
Nicholas Bervinchak was a social realist artist of the beginning of the 20th century. His career basically ran from about 1928 right up until the day he died in 1978. And he was really prolific in terms of his output. He did some 180 etchings, and he's been recognized as an artist who is really someone who chronicled the Depression in coal country in Pennsylvania. Nick's family came from the Rzepids area, Jaworska area of the Carpathian Mountains in southeastern Poland. They had come to coal country, anthracite region, somewhere in the early 1900s. And Nick was actually born in coal country in a town called Shenandoah, PA, near Mahanoy City in 1903. And so Nick grew up in the coal region. His dad actually became a miner. His father's name was Ivan or John. Mother's name was Fena Euphemia Polinsky. And they moved around a bit and eventually ended up in the Forestville Primrose area, which is the area where my dad grew up. Nick's life was kind of difficult. His dad died from injuries in a coal mine in 1908. His mom remarried, and they created a blended family. As my dad used to say, yours, mine, and ours, because we had a similar situation with my family. And the Bervinchak family, his stepfather actually became a coal miner and was also injured in the mines. So in the 5th grade, Nick had to stop school and go out and work to help support the family. At that time, there were probably about 10 or 11 children. Along the way, he had developed an interest in drawing. He would find scrap paper around. He tells a story about finding a sheet of paper from the butcher shop, which he found on a heap in Blackheath, and he started drawing on it. Eventually, he ended up in the mines like his dad and his stepfather before him around the age of, in 1918, and he became what was called a breaker boy. Now, the breaker boys were young kids who literally sat at the end of a long chute as the coal came out in huge chunks, and they had to break it up into smaller chunks into different sizes for different purposes. For example, there was pea coal, which could be used in the stoves. And then there was other types of coal for other kinds of purposes, for industrial purposes. So Nick was in the mines there in the 1920s, but all the while he kept thinking about how he could get out. And in 1924, he crossed paths with Paul Daubner, who was decorating St. Peter and Paul Byzantine Church in Minersville. And so Nick went over there. Nick had been working the night shift, so he was able to go during the daytime to St. Peter and Paul Byzantine Church. And he brought along a painting of the Trial of Christ, which he actually did. He used house paint and olive oil to paint it. It was not complete. But Daubner took one look at it and he said, wow, this is fantastic. How would you like to become my apprentice? I'll pay you the same amount that they're paying you in the mines and you can come work for me. Well, of course, Nick was thrilled by that. And that was the beginning of a very long relationship between Paul Daubner and Nick Bervinchak. And of course, the beginning of Nick's career. In terms of the pieces that I have, I think there are at least three which would characterize his work as an etcher. And probably I should mention in passing here how he came to be someone who did etching. When he connected with Paul Daubner in 1924, shortly thereafter, around 1926, he began to do pen and ink drawings. And Daubner looked at them and thought they were really very impressive. And he said to Bervinchak, you really ought to try etching. And of course, Bervinchak gave him a quizzical look and he said, "What's that?" And so Daubner explained it to him. And Nick, at the time, of course, didn't have the tools to do etching. So he used what he had at hand. He used a Victrola needle. He used some copper plates that he found in the mines. And basically a mixture of pitch and honey to cover the plate. And so around 1927, 1928, he began doing effectively his pen and ink drawings on copper plates. And these were his first etchings. And so one of the early ones that he did, which actually ended up at the Greenwich Village Art Show in 1932, of all places, was a piece called Toiling Miners. Now, the particular version that I have is from 1939, but I've seen versions much earlier than that, including one from about 1932 where Nick writes his signature in Ukrainian on the piece. And the scene is that of miners at the colliery in Primrose. And the colliery is just the operation of the mines. And so they're actually coming up from the mines at one point. But the detail, the fine detail, is just incredible on it. A second one, which is from a much later period, is called Olynyk's Breaker. And it's from 1978. Harry Olynyk lived right next door to Nick Bervinchak on Forestville Road in Primrose. So the Olynyks and the Bervinchaks were very close. And Harry, like many of the young able-bodied men at the time, went into the mines. He got his mining certificate in 1923. And, he worked in the mines until they began shutting down in the Great Depression. But as that happened, this whole underground industry began to develop there called bootleg mining. And of course, it had nothing to do with booze. Basically, the coal mine operators claimed to own all of the mineral rights underground in the entire area. And so an individual who owned any property technically was not supposed to be digging in the ground for coal at the time. But of course, come 1935 or so, probably 50% of the able-bodied men in the anthracite region were out of work because of the Depression. And so they had to do something to try to keep their families from starving. And so they began digging in the ground. They call them dog holes because that's what they looked like. They were very close to the surface, but they were mines. And, they developed these bootleg mines. And so they took whatever coal they could get. And then they would pool their money. Somebody would buy a truck. They would put the coal on a truck and then take it down to Philadelphia and Reading to sell it. And that's how they made money during that period. And so Harry Olynyk did a lot of that. And he became very good at it. And eventually, by the 1950s, mid 1950s, he set up his own coal breaker operation. He bought a piece of land near the Woods Tunnel in Forestville. And so this 1978 etching shows Harry Olynyk's breaker. And unfortunately, the breaker no longer exists. It was pulled down sometime in the 1990s. So this is another piece of coal country history. The third piece that I want to mention is also from 1978. It's called Potato Planters Ukraine. Nick and his second wife, Anna, took a trip to Ukraine in 1978, and that was sort of his Ukrainian period of etching. And he had a number of different etchings, but this one really sort of stands out. He also did an oil painting of potato planters in Ukraine. And so it just shows a quintessential Ukrainian scene. And so you have these three etchings, but, as I mentioned before, in all, he did over 180 etchings, and they are, at this point, scattered throughout the world. Some of them, I'm sure, are in thrift shops in different places, and many others are still in private hands.
So almost all of Bervinchak's secular work was this sort of social realist depiction of lives of ordinary people. But the work from the UHEC's collection that we actually want to focus on is something quite different. It's a portrait of Anna Sten, who's pretty much unknown today, except maybe to some old movie buffs. But she was actually reasonably well known back in the 1930s. So, what can you tell us about this rather unusual piece?
Yeah, it's very unusual. Anna Sten was actually born as Anna Petrovna Thesak in Kyiv, Ukraine, in the Russian Empire in 1908. She was the daughter of a Ukrainian father who was active in the theater in Kyiv and a Swedish mother. Her dad passed away sometime after World War I, and so her mother had to raise her, and her mother was ill at the time. So Anna actually had to start working at a fairly young age to help support her mom. Anna's mom was actually a prima ballerina with the ballet in Kyiv at one point. And so there was always an interest of theater and the arts around the house. And around the age of 15, Anna was, quote unquote, discovered by Konstantin Stanislavski of Stanislavski theater fame. She was discovered in Kyiv, and he offered to get her a connection with the Academy of Film in Moscow. And as you know, silent film was just developing there in the Russian Empire as well as in the rest of the world. Actually, at that point, the Russian Empire was no more, and Ukraine had been an independent state, and then parts of it became the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and parts of it became part of Poland. In any event, Anna wound up in Moscow. She got into, quote unquote, Russian film, and she married very young a gentleman by the name of Boris Bernstein, who, in terms of a stage name, was Boris Stenn. So she decided to take that name as her stage name, and that stuck with her for the rest of her life. She was married 2 more times after that, and eventually she would go with her second husband to Germany and became active in film in Germany. And it was there in the early 1930s, late 1920s, early 1930s, that a gentleman by the name of Sam Goldwyn of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer saw her and decided that he wanted to make her a new diva in Hollywood to rival Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich and some of the other grand dames there. And so she arrives here in 1932 and then heads out to California to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Sam invested a lot of money in her, but it was all for naught. For whatever reason, she did not become terribly popular with the American film audience. And so she was under contract with him from, I believe, 1932 to 1936. And then after that, he canceled the contract. He didn't renew it, actually.
But according to some accounts, the reason why Anna Sten didn't make it as a Hollywood star was because people thought her accent was too hard to understand. Apparently the joke was that the only person who could understand Anna Sten was Sam Goldwyn, who himself had a bit of an accent. And this actually even ended up as a verse in Cole Porter's famous song, Anything Goes.
When Sam Goldwyn can, with great conviction, instruct Anna Sten in diction, then Anna shows anything goes.
I personally find this a bit puzzling, because when I listen to Anna Sten, I don't find her accent hard to understand at all. But then again, I've been hearing English spoken with thick Slavic accents my whole life. Maybe Anglo movie audiences back in the 1930s really did have trouble understanding her. But I also can't help thinking that part of it was residual prejudice against Eastern and Southern Europeans. So a bombshell female star with a Swedish or German accent might be okay, but one from the Russian Empire, maybe not so much.
Getting back to the etching, so how does she end up being etched by Nick Bervinchak? Well, Nick, in addition to chronicling the lives of the ordinary people in coal country, also had a bit of an interest in popular personalities of the time. For example, I have an etching here at home of his where he did an etching of Edward VI of England, King of England. With Anna Sten, he actually discovered one of the publicity photos that were made of her for a film in 1934 called We Live Again. And this film was based on a Leo Tolstoy novel of 1899 called Resurrection. And it was all about the story of a Russian prince falling madly in love for a poor peasant girl. And I did some digging around and actually found the photo that Nick had seen. And if you look at the photo and you look at the etching, it's exactly the same. And if you're interested, you can actually find this photo if you go to gettyimages.com. They acquired some photos from the Corbis Bettman archives in New York City. And they were photos taken by a gentleman by the name of John Springer, and he was a publicist for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. So if you go to Getty Images and you put in Anna Sten, We Live Again, 1934, up will pop this photo, and if you put it side by side with the etching, you'll see that that's what Nick did. He had this photo in front of him, and he did an etching. Now, he actually sent the etching to her, but we have no record that she ever responded to him. She was, Anna Sten was very popular within the Ukrainian American community at that time because she was really the first pop culture icon that they had. And so many people were interested. And actually, if you go to the Ukrainian Weekly in that period, you'll see a couple of articles about her, other people trying to connect with her. But honestly, it doesn't seem like she was all that interested in the Ukrainian American community at that time. And if anyone is actually interested, you can find a copy on YouTube of We Live Again. Just put in We Live Again in 1934, and you can watch the hour and a half film from end to end.
Great. So thank you very much. Unless there's something else you want to mention. Uh,
Yeah, I think I just wanted to mention that I have an online gallery. It's called redpatchgallery.com. The reason it's called Red Patch is because the street where my dad grew up was called Red Patch. You know, in coal country, these little places where people lived close to the mines were called patches, coal patches. And so my dad's was Red Patch because at some point, I guess in the early 1900s, they used to paint the houses there with sort of an ochre color of paint. And where they got that from, I'm not sure. But anyway, that's where Red Patch came from. So redpatchgallery.com is online. On it, I have different collections of Bervinchak art, as well as some scenes from his church art, memorabilia, and also importantly, I've done 8 exhibits since 2012 of his art, including the one we did at the Ukrainian History and Education Center in 2016 in Somerset. And so I have memorabilia and photos from that as well. So I encourage people who might be interested in Bervinchak to go there and take a look. My email address is up there. If you want to talk about anything, please send me an email. You know, from time to time, I get email from all over the world. I had someone from Australia send me an email about 6 months ago saying, that's my grandmother who was in that photo or in that painting. And then they want me to try to go back and see what I can find out about it. So it's a lot of fun. It's a hobby. But anyway, Michael, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. So again, please come back to our ukrhec.org/stories for more content related to our museum and archives collections. Thank you very much.